Hermvids with Mr. Herman. Educational videos about reading and writing. How do I get started writing a story? Well, I'll tell you. This video helps all of you storytellers get started with your stories, including brainstorming techniques. Let's go. Gotta get brainstorming. Think. For this skill, we're going to learn how to come up with story ideas and plan those story ideas out. There's no one best way to do it. It's up to you. Whatever suits your needs. One possible way is to use something that happened to you as the basis for your story, but feel free to alter and change elements to suit your needs. Mark Twain had this famous quote, that's him right there, "Write what you know." That doesn't mean you can only write about things that you have experienced or places you've been, but it helps to have it based on something that you've experienced or you've felt before. This is why he wrote about stories occurring in a more rural area, because that's where he was from. Another option is to use something you read about in the news as a basis, but feel free to alter and change elements to suit your needs. That should be suit. So you could take a news story that was popular, you could take something that you heard about on the radio or watched on TV that was based on an actual nonfiction story and change it to give it elements of fiction. Edgar Allan Poe, when he wrote his story The Cask of Amontillado, which you may have read if you've gone through 9th grade, he wrote it after he read a newspaper article about the police finding a body that was buried alive. And his imagination ran wild and he came up with this story. So that's one possible way to come up with a potential story for your first one in this class. You could start with a tone of a story and then work on from there. So that tone list I showed you for the last section, you could start with a tone that you feel more suits you and then go from there and base your story on what would fit that tone. If you've read the novel Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson, which was turned into a movie starring Kristen Stewart, they start with a sarcastic, bitter tone, and that tone kind of goes all the way throughout, and you can see why Kristen Stewart would be selected for that, playing the main role. That's another great way to get going with a story idea. You could also start with a conflict, and then use this thing called Freytag story arc to fill in the rest. So if you know you want a conflict that is man versus man, or man versus time, you could start there and base the story around the conflict. Now, of course, man can be replaced with woman in any of these scenarios, and these conflicts don't cover every single conflict that's out there. But things like man versus himself can cover a lot of ground, like drug addiction, emotional problems, depression. Man versus time can cover a lot of different things, like a race or a relationship that's about to be destroyed. Man versus nature is survival. And then, there's always the man versus beast, which is mostly a horror story. Now, Freytag's story arc is a way to frame your stories. Not all stories have to be framed this way, but this is a good thing to keep in mind if you're a newcomer to storytelling. Now, in this story arc, stories begin with something called the exposition. The main character and the setting are exposed. The conflict hasn't begun yet. It's a way to establish things and set up your world. Some authors recommend skipping this, especially in science fiction, because you may end up spending a whole lot of time explaining your world before you get to the meat of the story. That's the inciting incident, where the conflict begins. If it's man versus beast, it's that moment where the man encounters the beast. If it is man versus himself, it's the moment where that person realizes that they have some sort of internal issue they have to deal with. The rising action is the longest part of the story. It's where the conflict gets more and more intense. The issues build, and there's, of course, breaks in between, but it gets things moving towards a climactic scene, which is the turning point of the conflict. It's where the story takes a total change because the main character has really addressed some core issue they've been grappling with the entire time. The following action is usually very short. It's the result of what happened in the climax. And then the resolution is how it ends. It doesn't have to be resolved nicely. Some authors just kind of abruptly end things, or don't resolve it with the main character getting what they want or solving their problem. This is just a general way to format. Now I'm going to show you some brainstorming techniques that are in the Google Drive folder. They should be able to help you out. These for your first story before you get going. It helps you organize and plot things out. The first one is the conflict and Freytag's arc. This helps you understand the cause and effect nature of the plot arc. That's one way to plot things out. You can use real life. These are some questions you can answer to help you brainstorm. It's from scholastic.com to help get you going with some good story ideas. This is a great positive negative brainstorming chart where you can chart where your character is and where you want them to end up by the end. Positive events on the top, negative events on the bottom. You create a line graph almost like math class. Then there's a storyboard, which is pretty popular in filmmaking and of course in comic books. If you're a more visual learner, this is a great way to plan out your story. I'm also going to teach you guys some digital ways in class this week. So whatever works for you, that's what you should do.